The mercenaries were a cold and efficient force, bred for one purpose: to hunt and capture. They had been hired to track down a woman, a human, whom they had been told was easy prey. She was supposed to be nothing more than a civilian, unarmed, untrained, and weak. Her lack of combat experience made her an ideal target. The job seemed like it would be quick and simple: capture her, take her back, and collect the reward. The leader of the mercenaries, a battle-hardened individual named Kale, gave orders with precision. His team was well-equipped and well-trained. They were used to capturing or eliminating anyone who stood in their way. This mission, however, was different. The woman was on a remote space station, far from any civilization. No backup, no assistance. It would be a simple hunt. They tracked her movements easily. The station was small, and she was alone. She moved in and out of the station's halls without much care, too unaware of the danger lurking around her. They found her near the outskirts, near an abandoned section of the station. She was a simple figure, walking aimlessly, unaware that her life was about to change. "Target sighted," Kale muttered into his calm. "Prepared to capture." The team moved silently, closing in on her position. They had anticipated resistance, perhaps some initial fear, but they were ready. They had dealt with humans before, and they knew they were fragile, easily intimidated. The woman was nothing more than another job, a means to an end. But something felt off. When they finally surrounded her, Kale saw it in her eyes: no fear, no panic, just a quiet calm. It was unexpected, unsettling. She didn't seem to care that they had her cornered. She wasn't begging for mercy. "Come with us," Kale ordered, his voice cold. The woman didn't move. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Kale was about to give another order when one of the mercenaries, Kor, spoke up. "Wait, her name." Kor's voice trailed off in disbelief. Kale shot him a glance, his patience wearing thin. "What about her name?" "Kor, you're losing focus," Kale snapped. "She's a target, nothing more." But Kor was staring at the woman, something clearly bothering him. He repeated the name under his breath. "Rinna Talvar." Kale's heart stopped. He froze, his mind racing. The name echoed in his thoughts: Rinna Talvar. The daughter of Talvar. The warrior who single-handedly wiped out the Xerkes, an entire alien army, in a battle that became a legend. He had heard the stories, the whispers, the myths about her father's ruthless, unstoppable legacy. Kale's grip tightened on his weapon. He had underestimated her, and now it seemed they had walked into a trap. The woman in front of him was no ordinary human. She wasn't a helpless civilian. She was Rinna, the last of her bloodline, the descendant of a warrior whose name struck fear into even the most powerful beings across the galaxy. The mercenaries exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence slipping away. Kor, wide-eyed, looked to Kale for guidance. Kale's mind raced, calculating the odds, but the truth was undeniable. They were no longer dealing with a mere human. They were facing a force far beyond their comprehension. Rinna stood still, her expression unchanged. There was no fear in her eyes, just a quiet knowledge. She had known this day would come. She had known that her father's enemies would eventually seek her out. But she was ready. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice calm but cold. Kale hesitated. "You're Rinna Talvar. And that makes me a legend," she said softly. "But it also makes me a target. So tell me, mercenary, how does it feel to realize you've made the greatest mistake of your life?" The mercenaries, once certain of their victory, were now shaking. They had heard of Rinna's father, Talvar, and his terrifying feats of combat. But they had never believed the stories, until now. The woman standing before them was no helpless civilian. She was the embodiment of a living legend, a warrior born of unimaginable power and skill. Rinna took a step forward, and the mercenaries instinctively took a step back. Kale's hand twitched toward his weapon, but he knew it would be useless. He could see it now, the way she moved, the way she held herself. It was the same as her father's. The same deadly calm. The same promise of destruction. If you thought you could simply capture me, she continued, her voice low but cutting, you were wrong. I am not my father. I am something far more dangerous. And you. She looked at each of them, her gaze lingering on Cale. You are already dead. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Cale knew they were in over their heads. They had no idea how to handle someone like her, someone with the blood of a legendary warrior running through her veins. Listen to me, Cale said, his voice strained. We don't have to fight. We can leave, we can go our separate ways. But Rinna wasn't listening. She had already made her choice. In an instant she moved. One mercenary dropped to the floor without a sound, incapacitated in the blink of an eye. Cale's heart raced as he watched her take out another without even breaking a sweat. She wasn't using brute force. She wasn't even trying. She was simply better. The remaining mercenaries hesitated, knowing that the odds were now stacked against them. Cale realized they couldn't win this fight. They couldn't even come close. As Rinna moved, taking them down one by one, Cale's mind raced. But then, just as quickly as she had started, she stopped. She stood still, breathing calmly, the mercenaries sprawled around her. The silence was deafening. You can leave, she said, her voice softer now. I will spare your lives. But remember this, never forget the name Rinna Talvar. Cale nodded, his face pale. He turned to his team, and without a word, they retreated, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape. As the last of the mercenaries fled, Rinna stood alone, her gaze fixed on the space ahead. The legends about her father had been true, but the galaxy would soon learn that the true legacy of Talvar lay not in his past victories, but in the woman who had inherited his legacy, and made it her own. Her name would echo across the stars once again, not as the daughter of a warrior, but as a warrior in her own right. And those who had once seen her as an easy target would remember her as the one who made them wish they had never crossed her path. The mercenaries stood frozen. The woman, their intended target, was not at all what they expected. She had not screamed for help, nor had she attempted to flee. Instead, she stood still, with an air of quiet certainty about her. Her calmness unnerved them more than any fear could have. The cold metal of the station around them felt suddenly oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Cale, the leader, eyed her cautiously, his fingers twitching over the grip of his blaster. He had seen his share of fights, but nothing had prepared him for this. She was a civilian, an easy target, or so they had thought. But now, there was something about her that didn't add up. The way she carried herself, so unflinchingly, this wasn't the fear of a helpless human. It was the calm of someone who had seen far worse. What's your name? Cale asked, keeping his tone neutral. It was the first thing that came to mind. There was something in the air that told him this woman was more than she appeared. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes seemed to pierce through him as though she were seeing far beyond the surface. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice smooth and chilling. Rinna Talvar. The words hit them like a shockwave. Rinna Talvar. Cale's heart skipped a beat. He had heard the name, of course. Everyone had. It was a legend. Her father, Talvar, was a name spoken with both fear and reverence in the darker corners of the galaxy. The warrior who had destroyed the Xerkes army in a single assault, the man whose name was etched into the annals of history. Cale had never believed it, until now. His gaze flicked to his team. Kor, one of his most trusted mercenaries, stood frozen, eyes wide. He muttered something under his breath, barely audible. It's her. It's really her. The others exchanged looks, confusion and fear spreading through them. The job had seemed so simple, so straightforward. They were supposed to capture a weak, defenseless human. But now, facing this woman, they were confronted with something they hadn't planned for. The reputation of her bloodline, the legacy of destruction, it loomed over them like a dark cloud. Cale could feel his confidence slipping. The mission was starting to feel more like a death sentence. Do you know who I am? Rinna asked again, her voice cutting through the tension. The words hung in the air, each syllable weightier than the last. Kale forced himself to swallow the growing lump in his throat, his mind racing. "You're Rina Talvar," he replied, his voice thick with unease. "And what does that mean to you?" Rina's voice was quieter now, almost dismissive, but there was a sharpness to it, a knowing. Kale's mind scrambled for the right words. "It means—" He paused, uncertain. "It means you're dangerous." Rina's lips curled into a faint, almost sad smile. "Dangerous," she repeated softly. "No. I'm just someone who understands the value of survival. That's why I'm here." Kale shifted uncomfortably. "You've got nowhere to run. We're not leaving without you." Rina met his gaze, and for the first time, Kale felt a true sense of vulnerability. "You've already made your mistake," she said, almost conversationally. "And now you have a choice. You can leave and live. Or you can stay and face what comes next." The mercenaries were hesitant, uncertainty creeping into their movements. They had been trained to fight, to dominate. But Rina's mere presence was a reminder of something far greater, something they were ill-prepared to deal with. The stories of her father, the brutal efficiency with which he had crushed entire armies, the sheer terror he had instilled in his enemies, flooded Kale's mind. For a brief moment, Kale considered retreating. The job wasn't worth this kind of risk. But then he remembered the payday, the reward that awaited them. He couldn't turn back now. Not without a fight. "Take her down," he ordered, his voice steady but betraying a hint of fear. The mercenaries lunged, and the air around them seemed to thrum with anticipation. Kale expected a struggle, the usual skirmish that followed every capture. But this was different. In an instant Rina moved. Her speed, her precision, it was like nothing the mercenaries had ever seen. One of them, Roque, barely had time to raise his weapon before he was disarmed. In a blur, Rina incapacitated him with a single fluid motion, her foot striking him in the chest, sending him sprawling. She didn't even break a sweat. Kale's heart raced as he watched the scene unfold. Rina wasn't just skilled, she was calculating, methodical. She wasn't here to merely defend herself, she was here to make them regret their decision. "Anyone else?" she asked calmly, her eyes scanning the group. The mercenaries hesitated. Roque lay unconscious on the floor, another mercenary, Rian, nursing a wound on his arm. They were out of their depth. But Kale wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He tried to rally his team. "Don't let her get inside your head," he growled. "Take her down. She's just one woman." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it wasn't true. She wasn't just one woman. She was something far more dangerous. The stories weren't just stories. Rina was real, and she was nothing like they had imagined. She moved again, faster this time. Kale barely had time to react. Rian lunged toward her, but she sidestepped him effortlessly, twisting his arm behind his back. Before he could cry out, she slammed him into the floor with a force that left him gasping for air. Kale's blaster was still in his hand, but his fingers felt numb. He was realizing, too late, that there was no winning here. The woman standing before him wasn't just the daughter of a legend. She was the embodiment of everything that made that legend real. And he had made the fatal mistake of underestimating her. Rina turned to face him, her expression calm. "You can leave, Kale. I'll let you go. But know this, you've seen what I can do. And if you ever come after me again, I won't hesitate." Kale's throat tightened. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words. "Leave," Rina said softly. "Before you make this even worse for yourselves." The mercenaries looked to Kale, who hesitated, his mind spinning. They had come for an easy job, for a payday. But now, they had found something far more terrifying than they had bargained for. Without another word, Kale signaled for his team to retreat. One by one, they backed away, not daring to challenge her any further. As they left, Rina stood still, watching them go. Her father's legacy wasn't just a myth. And neither was she. The mercenaries would remember this day. The galaxy would remember her name. The mercenaries were scrambling now, a sense of desperation replacing their initial confidence. Cale could feel it deep in his gut. He had underestimated her, and now they were facing the consequences. They had come to capture a woman, a seemingly defenseless civilian, but instead, they were confronted with a living nightmare. Rinna Talvar was not just the daughter of a legendary warrior, she was a force to be reckoned with in her own right. Cale turned to his remaining team, trying to steady himself. His breath was shallow, his hands were shaking. He had been in countless battles, but nothing had prepared him for this. Rinna had torn through them effortlessly, incapacitating 2 of his men without even breaking a sweat. Now, only a handful of them remained, and they were all beginning to understand that the job they thought would be easy was far from it. Kor, standing beside him, was visibly rattled. "We need to get out of here, Cale," he said, his voice low, filled with panic. "She's not just some woman. She's a legend. We can't fight her. We'll die." Cale shot him a sharp look, trying to maintain his composure. "Shut up, Kor. We're mercenaries. We don't run." But even as the words left his mouth, Cale knew the truth. They couldn't win this. Not against someone like her. Rinna's skill was beyond anything they had encountered, and they were woefully outmatched. Every move she made was calculated, precise, no wasted effort, no hesitation. She had taken them apart piece by piece, and they were only moments away from becoming her next victims. The remaining mercenaries exchanged nervous glances. They had come here to hunt, to capture a weak human woman, but now they were the ones being hunted. The silence in the room was deafening, the weight of the realization hanging heavily in the air. They couldn't take her down. They couldn't even escape. "Cale," Kor said again, this time with more urgency. "We can't do this. We need her. She's our only chance to survive what's coming." Cale turned sharply toward him, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Kor was right. They had no choice but to ask for her help. The Mercenaries were closing in, their fleet descending upon the space station. The Mercenaries were ruthless, and if the mercenaries didn't come up with a plan fast, they'd all be dead before they had a chance to escape. "We need to work with her," Cale muttered, the realization dawning on him. "We need Rinna's help if we want to survive." Without another word, he turned to face her. Rinna stood in front of them, her posture unwavering, her expression unreadable. She had not moved since taking down 2 of their men. It was clear she had more than enough power to wipe them all out. But for some reason, she had stopped. She had let them live. Cale stepped forward cautiously, his voice steady but laced with reluctance. "Rinna, we need your help. The Mercenaries are coming. If we don't work together, we won't survive." For the first time, a flicker of emotion passed across Rinna's face, a brief moment of contemplation. Then, just as quickly it was gone, replaced by the same cold, calculating gaze that had terrified them from the start. "You want my help?" she asked, her voice sharp, as if weighing every word. "Why should I save you?" Cale hesitated, his mind racing. He was no stranger to negotiating, to using every advantage he had, but this was different. They weren't just negotiating with a merciless foe. They were bargaining with someone who could end their lives with a flick of her wrist. "I'm not asking for mercy," Cale said, his voice firm. "We've made a mistake. But we're not the ones who will suffer. If the Mercenaries find us, we're all dead. You know that. I know you're capable of taking them down, but we'll need more than just your strength. We need strategy. We need to work together." Rinna's gaze never wavered. She looked at him, her eyes piercing, as though seeing straight through him. The silence stretched on, thick with tension. Finally she spoke. "Very well," she said, her voice almost a whisper, but her words carrying the weight of finality. "But know this, I'm not saving you. I'm saving myself. If you get in my way, I'll kill you without hesitation." Cale nodded, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew that somehow, he had convinced her. The mercenaries had not earned her trust. They had done nothing to deserve her mercy. But now, they were bound to her, and there was no turning back. "We'll follow your lead," Cale said, his voice steady, though he could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. "What do we do?" Rinna's eyes shifted toward the distance, as though already assessing the situation. She was thinking ahead, calculating their options. "We'll fight the Zerkries on my terms," she said, her tone cold and precise. "You'll follow my commands, and you will do exactly as I say. If you don't, you won't survive. Understand?" The mercenaries nodded, some of them still in shock, others more eager to comply. They had no choice. They would follow her, if they wanted to live. "Good," Rinna said, turning away, her focus returning to the task at hand. "Let's get to work." With that, she began issuing orders. She didn't waste time explaining herself or holding back. Every movement she made was deliberate, calculated. She knew exactly what needed to be done, and she expected the mercenaries to keep up. They had no room for error, no time for hesitation. The Zerkries were coming, and Rinna wasn't going to waste a second. Kale watched her, a mix of awe and fear building in his chest. They had thought they were the hunters. But now, they were simply players in her game, a game that they didn't understand, and one that they had no choice but to play. The Zerkries were close. But Rinna Talvar was ready, and she wasn't about to let anyone, mercenary or alien, stand in her way. The Zerkries arrived with the kind of fury only an advanced, vengeful fleet could muster. Their ships filled the sky, an overwhelming force that blocked out the stars. Kale and his team had barely managed to get into position when Rinna took charge. She moved swiftly, calculating each step with lethal precision. The mercenaries, still shaken from their earlier encounter with her, had no choice but to follow her lead. "Get to the central command room," Rinna ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Set up the defenses. We don't have much time." Kale nodded, his mind still spinning. He had never seen anyone move so quickly, so decisively. She was everywhere at once, barking orders, setting traps, positioning them in the most strategic locations. The mercenaries, still reeling from the shock of having her save them, were now focused, responding to her commands without question. They knew they had no other choice. If they didn't follow, they would die. Kale could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. He kept looking at Rinna, trying to understand how she could be so calm in the face of certain destruction. She had been trained for this. It was in her blood. She wasn't just going to survive, she was going to win. The Zerkries were closing in fast. Rinna didn't hesitate. She took out a map of the station, quickly pinpointing weak points, places where they could make a stand. "We'll need to divide them," she said. "Some of you stay here to set up the explosives. The rest of you will need to set up traps along the main corridors. We can't let them overwhelm us." The mercenaries had never worked this way before. They had always been used to brute force, always relying on sheer strength. But now they were working with someone who thought on a different level, someone who could see the battlefield as a chessboard, with every move calculated, every piece in place. Rinna's strategy was simple, but brutal. She knew the Zerkries would come at them from multiple angles, and she wasn't going to let them get close enough to engage in a full-on battle. Instead, she had set traps in every hallway, every door. The mercenaries were only there to buy time, time for her to finish what she had started. The Zerkries breached the first barricade with ease, their weapons cutting through the defenses like butter. But Rinna was already ahead of them. She activated a series of explosives hidden in the walls, sending a wave of shock through the Zerkries' ranks. They were disoriented, confused, unsure of how to proceed. Kale watched in awe as Rinna moved through the chaos like a shadow. She was everywhere at once, taking down Zerkri soldiers with swift, efficient strikes. Each blow was deliberate, each movement designed to incapacitate without wasting a second. She was a force of nature, unstoppable in her own right. The mercenaries fought hard, following Rinna's instructions, but they were only pawns in this game. They set traps, fired weapons, and took down as many Zerkris as they could, but it was Rinna who was the real power here. She wasn't just fighting, she was dismantling the Zerkris' entire assault. Every Zerkri soldier who advanced was met with an ambush, each step leading them into a trap they couldn't escape. Hours passed, and the station was slowly becoming a battleground. The Mercenaries, realizing they were being outmaneuvered, tried to regroup. But Rinna was one step ahead of them. The mercenaries were beginning to feel it too. They were following her orders, and it was working. The Mercenaries were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. Rinna had turned the tables. Kale could feel the tide shifting. The Mercenaries were starting to falter. They had never anticipated a fight like this, and now they were losing ground. The mercenaries, once desperate and outmatched, were beginning to believe that victory was possible. Rinna's presence, her leadership, had transformed them from prey into contenders. But Rinna wasn't finished. She was calculating every move, always thinking several steps ahead. She knew this battle was just the beginning. The Mercenaries were persistent, and they would return, stronger than before. But for now, they were retreating, regrouping. And that was all she needed. Kale stood next to her as the last of the Mercenaries soldiers fled the station, their forces scattered. The mercenaries were battered, but they were alive. And it was all thanks to Rinna. "We did it," Kale said, his voice filled with disbelief. "We actually did it." Rinna didn't answer immediately. She was already assessing the damage, analyzing the next steps. "We won," she said, her tone matter-of-fact, as if it was nothing more than another day's work. "But this isn't over. The Mercenaries will come again. And next time, they'll be ready." Kale nodded. He understood now. They had been lucky. The Mercenaries might have been caught off guard, but next time they wouldn't be. And if they were going to survive, they would need Rinna, her strategy, her mind, her unmatched ability to think and fight with the same ruthless precision. Rinna turned to him then, her eyes cold, calculating. "You wanted my help," she said. "Now you'll need to prove that you're worth it. This war isn't over. And if you want to stay alive, you'll keep following my lead." Kale didn't hesitate. "We're with you, Rinna. Whatever it takes." Rinna's gaze softened for a moment, just a brief flicker of something unspoken, but it was gone before Kale could interpret it. She turned her back to him, staring at the horizon, her mind already focused on the next battle. The Mercenaries might have retreated, but they were not defeated. And Rinna, with her legacy and unmatched skills, was ready to finish what her father had started. The galaxy would know her name, not just as the daughter of a legend, but as a force that would stop at nothing to protect what was hers. And the mercenaries, once prey, were now her allies, whether they liked it or not.